Dust explodes across the African plain like a bomb detonating. A massive lion, his golden coat matted with sweat and desperation, crashes through the dry brush with nothing but terror driving him forward. Behind him, something moves that shouldn't exist in the modern world. An ancient creature, a living dinosaur, a force of nature that has remained virtually unchanged for millions of years. A rhino, easily 2 tons of solid muscle and rage, charges with the kind of determination that says one thing with absolute clarity. This isn't about survival anymore. This is about punishment. The rhino's horn, nearly 6 feet long and wickedly sharp, gleams in the afternoon sun like a blade forged in hell. The lion's roars have become desperate, almost pleading, but the rhino doesn't care, doesn't slow down, doesn't show mercy. For the next 15 minutes, what unfolds on this stretch of savanna will become a lesson in nature's brutal honesty, a lesson about what happens when apex predators meet something they fundamentally underestimated, a lesson that will haunt this lion for the rest of his life. But before we witness the full destruction of this moment, you need to understand how a creature as powerful as a lion found himself in this position in the first place. Because this isn't a story about a random encounter. This is a story about a hunter becoming the hunted. This is a story about a rhino that refused to be prey anymore. 3 days before this catastrophic moment, the lion's name was Xander, and he ruled his territory with the kind of casual confidence that comes from never losing a fight. Xander was a magnificent specimen of predatory perfection. His mane, dark and full, covered his massive shoulders like armor. His body, lean and muscular, carried at least 430 pounds of pure killing efficiency. His claws, retractable and sharp as surgical steel, had torn through hide and bone more times than he could count. At 9 years old, Xander stood in his prime. He had claimed this territory 7 years ago by destroying the previous dominant male in a battle that lasted nearly 40 minutes. Since that day, he had killed everything he hunted. He had mated with the females he wanted. He had eaten first, always. The other lions in his region knew his scent and respected it. The prey animals scattered at the sound of his roar. Even the hyenas, those scavengers with their deceptive intelligence, avoided him at all costs. Xander's territory stretched across nearly 80 square kilometers of prime hunting ground. A river ran through the western section, providing water during the dry season. Grasslands in the south teemed with zebra and wildebeest during migration. Scattered acacia groves offered shade and shelter. It was the kind of territory that most lions would kill to claim, and Xander had killed to keep it. He lived with 4 lionesses who were responsible for bringing down most of the actual prey. The females did the dangerous work of hunting, while Xander did what dominant males do. He protected the territory, he mated, and he ate. The system was brutal but efficient. The females had provided him with 6 cubs over the years, all of whom had survived to adulthood. His bloodline was strong, his legacy was secure, or at least that's what he believed. The territory had always contained danger, of course. All wild places do. There were other predators, hyena clans that occasionally grew bold enough to challenge him for kills, leopards that hunted in the darkness, occasional nomadic male lions that tested his borders. But Xander had defeated all of them. His confidence had transformed into something else over time, arrogance. He had begun to believe himself invincible. The rhino that would change everything was named Casirini, which meant the unbreakable one in the local language. Casirini had lived in this region for 18 years. He had survived droughts that killed thousands of animals. He had survived poaching attempts that left him scarred and angry. He had survived other rhinos that challenged him during breeding season. He had survived everything Africa could throw at him because he was, quite simply, a survivor. But for most of those 18 years, Casirini had tried to be peaceful. Rhinos are not naturally aggressive animals, despite their fearsome appearance. They want to eat vegetation. They want to find water. They want to be left alone. Casirini had asked for nothing more. He had never bothered the lions, never challenged them, never done anything except exist and try to live his life without causing trouble. The problem was that Xander had noticed Casirini's reluctance to fight back, and he had interpreted it as weakness. 2 weeks before the brutal encounter that would define both their lives, Xander had decided to test this belief. He had stalked Casirini for hours, circling, roaring, challenging. The rhino had done what rhinos do when confronted with predators. He had run, not out of fear, but out of pragmatism. There was no benefit in fighting a lion. No food to gain, no territory to claim, just unnecessary risk. Xander had mistaken that pragmatism for cowardice. He had continued to harass Cassirini over the following days. Each time the rhino retreated. Each time, Xander's confidence grew. The lion had begun to view the rhino not as a fellow apex predator, but as something else entirely, a potential kill, a creature to hunt, a way to prove his absolute dominance over his territory. No lion had successfully killed an adult rhino in living memory. The risk was too high, the reward too low, but Xander had become the kind of predator who hunted not out of hunger, but out of something darker: pride, ego, the desire to prove something he had already proved countless times. 3 days before the moment in the dust, Xander had finally decided to end this. He had gone out at dawn with a plan that was simple and direct: isolate the rhino, attack from the blind side, bring him down. Xander had killed buffalo before, animals that weighed nearly as much as rhinos. He had confidence. He had strategy. He had no idea what he was walking into. Cassirini had been drinking at a waterhole in the northern section of Xander's territory when the lion first appeared. The rhino had seen the approach immediately. This wasn't subtlety. This was a lion walking directly toward him with death in his eyes. Cassirini had stood his ground initially, testing whether the lion was serious. The roar Xander released told him everything he needed to know. This was serious. This was different from the previous encounters. This was a lion who believed he could end this life. So Cassirini had run, not because he wanted to, but because running was safer than fighting. For hours, the lion had chased the rhino across the savannah, through thickets of thorny brush, across rocky terrain. Xander had been relentless, driven by something that had nothing to do with hunger or territorial instinct. This had become personal for him somehow. This had become a quest to prove his absolute superiority. By the time the sun reached its peak, both animals had been pushed to their physical limits. Xander's sides heaved as he breathed. His mouth had become dry from exertion. The rhino's pace had slowed. He was tiring. The lion could smell it in the wind, could sense it in the way the rhino's running had become less coordinated. That's when Xander had decided to make his move. The attack had come in the open grassland, far from trees or rock formations that the rhino could use for protection. Xander had circled wide, trying to get ahead of Cassirini and cut off his forward momentum. The plan had been to force the rhino into a collision, to use his speed and agility to dodge the charging bulk and attack from the sides. It should have worked. The strategy was sound, but something had happened in that moment that changed everything. Cassirini had stopped running. The rhino had simply planted his legs and turned to face the charging lion. His eyes had cleared of the panic that fear creates. Something ancient and primal had risen from deep inside him. For 18 years he had been running. For 18 years he had tried to avoid confrontation. For 18 years he had respected the lions and their dominance. Today was the day that ended. Xander had been moving at full speed, committed to his attack, unable to change trajectory when the rhino stopped. The lion had tried to leap aside, tried to dodge, tried to use his superior agility to avoid impact. He had almost succeeded. His body had twisted in midair. His claws had extended seeking purchase. But physics was not on his side. Cassirini had lowered his head. The impact between the lion and the rhino had been catastrophic. The horn, blunt compared to the sharpened weapons of predators designed to slash and tear, had hit Xander directly in the ribs. The force of impact had sent the lion flying backward through the air like he weighed nothing. He had crashed into the earth hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. For several seconds, he couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't do anything except lie in the dust and wonder what had just happened. When his vision cleared, Xander had seen the rhino standing over him, breathing heavily, those ancient eyes burning with something that looked remarkably like anger. The rhino hadn't run, hadn't given up, hadn't submitted to the natural order that everyone said the lion belonged to. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment Xander realized his mistake. But Xander was a survivor. More than that, he was a fighter. The blow had hurt, had knocked something loose inside his chest that made breathing difficult. But it hadn't killed him, hadn't even seriously injured him. So he had done what lions do. He had gotten back up. For the next several hours, the two of them had fought across that stretch of grassland. Xander would charge, and Cassirini would meet the charge. The lion would try to circle, and the rhino would turn, always keeping his front toward the predator, always protecting his vulnerable flanks and rear. The lion's claws would rake across the rhino's hide, drawing blood, tearing into thick skin. But the wounds were superficial. The rhino's hide was designed by nature to withstand exactly this kind of punishment. By evening, when they had finally separated, Xander had been the one who retreated. His pride had been shattered. His arrogance had been broken. His certainty about his place at the top of the food chain had been fundamentally challenged. He had returned to his females that night, bloodied and exhausted, and refused to tell them what had happened. The next day, he had tried to put the encounter out of his mind. He had hunted. He had eaten. He had done the things that dominant lions do. But something had changed inside him. Some part of him had been damaged more deeply than any claw could reach. That's where the situation might have ended. Xander could have accepted the lesson, could have learned that some creatures were not meant to be hunted, could have moved on with his life and ruled his territory without further incident. But pride is a powerful force in nature. On the morning of the third day, Xander had woken up and felt the shame. The knowledge that a rhino, a herbivore, a creature that he had been taught since cubhood was beneath him, had beaten him. The rhino hadn't tried to kill him. That would have been honorable in a way. The rhino had simply refused to let himself be prey anymore. And that refusal had stripped Xander of something he had believed was fundamental to his identity. He had to try again. He had to prove that yesterday was a fluke, that the lion truly belonged at the top of the hierarchy. He had found Casarini again near the same waterhole where the first encounter had begun. The rhino had seen him coming and had shown no fear. If anything, the rhino had looked almost like he had been waiting for the lion to make the same mistake twice. This time, Xander had brought reinforcements. He had found a nomadic male, a younger lion named Kimani, who had been wandering the edges of Xander's territory for weeks. Xander had offered him a deal, help him take down the rhino, and Xander would allow him to remain in the territory, to hunt alongside the pride. Kimani had agreed without hesitation. The promise of a stable territory, of reliable food and access to females, was too tempting to resist. The two lions had approached from different angles. The plan was to distract Casarini with frontal attacks, while the other lion attacked from the side. It was the kind of strategy that worked well against prey animals. It was the kind of strategy that might have worked if Casarini had been a helpless target. But Casarini wasn't helpless. He had learned in the first encounter exactly how to handle predators. He had learned that lions were faster, but that he was stronger. He had learned that his horn was a weapon equal to any claw. He had learned that retreat was no longer necessary. The rhino had charged directly at Xander, ignoring the pain of impact, ignoring the scratch marks that the lion's claws had created across his hide. He had driven the dominant male backward, forcing him to retreat simply to avoid being gored. Kimani had tried to circle and strike from the side, but Casarini had twisted his massive body with surprising agility and had nearly impaled the younger lion on his horn. Kimani had yelped and scrambled backward, suddenly understanding that he had made a terrible mistake accepting this deal. The two lions had been forced to retreat together, running from a rhino that was no longer interested in running itself. Casarini had chased them for over a mile, his determination absolute, his fury focused. When they had finally distanced themselves enough to be safe, both lions had been breathing so hard they couldn't roar. That night, Kimani had left Xander's territory and had never returned. But Xander had stayed. He had remained in his territory, haunted by the image of a rhino that wouldn't submit, a creature that couldn't be intimidated, a living proof that his dominance had limits. For 2 days he had tried to ignore it, had tried to return to his normal routines, but on the morning of the third day, something inside him had snapped. It wasn't rational, it wasn't smart, it was pure, unfiltered rage, the kind of rage that doesn't plan, the kind of rage that simply acts. He had gone out alone at dawn, and he had found Casarini. This time there was no strategy, no attempt to be clever. This was just two predators meeting in the dust with one question to be answered. Which one would refuse to back down? The chase that had followed would become legendary in the way that certain moments in nature become legendary. Local rangers would document it, tourists would hear the stories, other lions would learn about it through the mysterious communication of the wild. But in the moment itself, there was nothing legendary about it. There was only desperation and fury, and the primal need to prove dominance. Xander had charged again and again. Casarini had met every charge. The lion had tried to leap onto the rhino's back, had tried to use his agility to find a vulnerable spot, had tried everything his 9 years of dominance had taught him to try. Nothing had worked. The first 15 minutes had been the worst. That's when Xander still had energy. That's when he still believed he could win. That's when his attacks had been fierce and coordinated and nearly effective. He had managed to rake his claws across Casarini's face, opening a wound that bled freely. He had bitten the rhino's shoulder, tearing away a chunk of flesh. He had knocked the rhino down once, had leaped on him, had been this close to finding the throat and ending it all. But Casarini had gotten up. The rhino had simply stood up and shaken the lion off like he weighed nothing. Around the 10-minute mark, the dynamic had shifted. Xander's attacks had become less coordinated. His breathing had become ragged. The wounds the rhino had inflicted with his horn were beginning to cause real pain. There was a gash across Xander's hip, deep enough that the lion could see muscle. There were puncture wounds on his shoulder where the horn had driven through his hide. His left front leg wasn't functioning properly, and he wasn't sure if something had been broken or just badly bruised. By the 15-minute mark, Xander had been done. The final moments of the encounter were the ones that would haunt him forever. Casarini, covered in his own blood, breathing so heavily he could barely stand, had driven Xander into the dust one final time. The lion had been too exhausted to keep fighting, too hurt, too broken. When the rhino had come at him, Xander had done something he had never done in his life. He had run. The rhino had chased him for another 100 meters before stopping, satisfied that the message had been delivered. Xander had kept running, kept moving away, didn't stop until he was back in the shaded grove where his females rested during the heat of day. For the next 3 weeks, Xander had healed. The wounds had slowly closed. The puncture marks had scabbed over. The broken rib, because that's what it had been, had slowly knitted itself back together. But something else had been broken that day, something that no amount of healing could fix. Xander's certainty about his place in the world was gone. He never returned to the waterhole where Casarini drank. He never again attempted to hunt anything that had horns. He never again charged without thinking through the consequences first. He had learned a lesson that nature teaches very few predators, that dominance is not absolute, that confidence can betray you, that there are always creatures in the world that can hurt you if you're not careful. Casarini lived another 9 years after that encounter. He never killed the lion, never attempted to cross into truly dangerous territory. He simply lived his life and drank from his waterhole and allowed the lion to give him space. The two of them developed a kind of understanding, a mutual respect born from violence that had taught both of them something valuable. Xander's territory remained stable for another 5 years. He continued to rule his land, but with less arrogance, with more awareness that the world was more complex than he had believed. When younger males challenged him, he met the challenges with intelligence rather than pure rage. He lasted longer as a dominant male than most, holding his territory until age finally caught up with him. But every evening, when he looked toward the northern section of his territory, he remembered the dust and the charge, and the moment when his certainty had shattered like glass. He remembered the day a rhino made him pay for 15 brutal minutes that changed everything. The lesson lives on in that territory to this day. Lions there learn early that not every creature belongs to the category of prey. They learn that confidence without respect is a recipe for disaster. They learn that the wild is far more complicated than simple hierarchies and dominance. They learn that sometimes the greatest teachers are the ones that hurt us the most. What would you have done if you were that lion? Would you have tried again after the first defeat? Would you have brought reinforcements? Or would you have accepted the lesson and moved on? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story about the clash between predators moved you, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another incredible tale from the African wilderness. Because the savannah has countless stories like this, stories about creatures that refuse to be what others have decided they should be, stories about the moments when arrogance meets reality, stories about the kind of lessons that change lives forever.